后端端白浅浅，一起排队就翻翻。做完饭问题翻翻，做完饭饭都蛋蛋，蛋蛋出来，一起排队就翻翻。大家带着方团团，不能出去胡端端，胡端端可能都端端，弄不好养汤板板。
观众朋友们好，现在是美国东部时间5月24日，这里是华尔街网报当日第1期节目。现在我们继续为您带来有关中国以及世界的最新消息。首先要为您看到的是来自中央社的报道，在微博上有不少网友转发刚才您看到的这一首托广做核酸的儿歌，其中说做酸酸也就是核酸，防罐罐也就是新冠。这一首改编儿歌用儿童语言描述做核酸的经历，红色盖子的试管和白棉签在歌中是红管管和白签签，要求小朋友排队一起做酸酸，做完酸酸吃饭饭，吃完饭饭等丹丹，丹丹出来继续排队做酸酸，在家待着防罐罐，没事不能胡转转，胡转可能得罐罐，闹得不好躺板板。在网上搜寻可见，有河南政府官方微博郑州发布了类似的儿歌图卡。这一首推广做核酸的儿歌，可能是改编自另外一首民谣《红伞伞白干干，吃完一起躺板板，躺板板埋山山，亲朋都来吃饭饭。做酸酸的儿歌让人想到在2020年时同样由儿童演唱的方舱医院真神奇。再为您关注到的是梁建章有关的消息。携程董事主席梁建章一直以来关注人口问题，他表示自己是关心推进人口改革政策的人。据网友发现，在昨天晚些时候，携程这一位联合创始人，同时也是北大光华管理学院教授的梁建章，微博已经禁言。现在登录梁建章微博，可以看到上面显示，因违反相关法律法规，该用户目前处于禁言状态。据公开资料显示，梁建章52岁，生于上海，是复旦大学少年班毕业，获得佐治亚理工学院计算机系硕士学位。在99年的时候，与沈南鹏、范民等人共同创建了携程网，之后担任 CEO。2003年担任董事局主席，2011年的时候又获得了斯坦福大学的经济学博士学位。梁建章从2011年开始写作中国人口有关消息，第一本人口学书籍是《中国人口太多了吗》。他表示，未来影响中国经济最大的因素会是人口政策。在新冠疫情爆发之后，梁建章多次发表文章。在清华大学李道葵教授此前表示，中国过去2年的防疫相当于每个人人均寿命增加10天，论述1%的人均消费增长能够提高每天10天的生命之后，梁建章发表文章和李道葵商榷防疫政策的生命账，反驳李道葵的说法。他说，过度严防死守的政策造成总的人均寿命损失是，避免死亡收益是1天，减去因为经济下降造成人均寿命减损5天，答案是-4天。他说，按照这样的计算，每个月就会损失4天的人均寿命。可以说，李道葵所说的过去2年成功攒下的人均寿命增加10天的盈余，几个月的封城就全都清零还回去了。梁建章还表示，零风险零感染是所有人都希望实现的目标，但是从现实出发，应该追求的目标是在维持社会经济正常秩序的前提下，将疫情控制在较低的水平。他表示，现在防控占用了大量医疗资源，需要抽出很多人员来开展流调、扫码、体温检测、测核酸等，有很多的医疗资源投入防控，减少对于其他疾病的资源投入，也增加了其他疾病的死亡率。再为您关注到的是北京方面的消息。中共中央政治局委员、国务院副总理孙春兰在5月23日到北京调研指导疫情防控工作。他表示，要刻不容缓，加快聚集性疫情处置。 根据中国媒体的报道，孙春兰离到海淀区东城区实地考察发生聚集性疫情的地方，主要了解了重点场所的防控、流调等情况，并且到疫情防控指挥部召开了座谈会。在会上，他强调要坚持动态清零总方针，加快流调转运隔离速度，刻不容缓，以快制快，尽快实现社会面清零。同时，他表示要严格闭环管理，防止出现聚集疫情，组织核酸筛查，在重点地区则要开展敲门行动，确保应检尽检，尽早发现阳性感染者，阻断传播链。又说，流行病学调查要更加细致深入。他说，要确保风险人群全部在管控范围之内，严格落实防控措施，避免封而不控，管而不严，同时保障居民基本生活和正常就医要求。实行居家办公的区域要从严管控流动，同时加强高效疫情防控工作，做好师生生活保障和心理疏导，加强疫情发布和信息政策解读，以解决群众的困难。再我给您关注到的是达沃斯有关的消息。美国国会议员麦考尔此前批评，在达沃斯世界经济论坛上为泽伦斯基演讲鼓掌时，中国代表没有站起来。但是，据财新网发现，照片中的人物不是中国方面，而是越南方面。此前在接受 CNN 直播采访时，国会议员麦考尔提到了这一张照片，指责中国方面当时在泽伦斯基发布演讲时走出了房间。而这样的表态被认为是显示了中国对于乌克兰战争的立场，很快在网络引起了流传。但是通过对比照片，财新网确定 CNN 节目中显示的照片人物是由越南副总理李明凯代表的代表成员，而接近代表团的人士向财新证实了他们的身份。越南方面没有回应关于此事的提问，而中国代表团则通过官方媒体反驳麦考尔的指责。中国方面代表团由气候特使谢振华率领，在泽伦斯基讲话期间，在与国际能源署执行主任比罗尔会面。代表团的消息人士向财新表示，谢振华在上午11点15分至12点15分之间与比罗尔进行闭门会谈，当时双方讨论的内容是全球能源转型以及中国的绿色经济。再为您关注到的是布林肯对华政策演说的最新日期。美国媒体 Political 引述3位消息人士披露，国务卿布林肯将在5月26日发布对华政策演说。原定布林肯将在本月5日发布有关演讲，但是新冠检测结果呈阳性后，演讲被推迟。消息人士表示，布林肯在演讲中将触及美国政府现有对华政策。据报道，布林肯将不会提供如何执行对华战略的详情，对华策略全文不会对外公布。
One will be discussing some very important issues, some sensitive issues. I hope this will help us build confidence and enable us to work together in advancing and promotion and cooperation of human rights in China, but also at the global level.
说你关键不行啊！我靠，你关键怎么行？对呀，这个男的有点傻屌。
过来吧。
你自己选的还是随机号？错过了。
以后你可以给他当个助理。
把鬓角给你剪短一点。
嗯，对的，要翘。
翘，我剪完不会翘的。
嗯。
这一刻我是最开心的，真的，我动起来，我觉得我很充实。
啊，好看，好看。
好看了吗？
那必须好看。
剪得好。
要求大家都会解决了，不用在那儿说，没必要，好吧？好，来，大家稍微分散一点，稍微分散一点。不要，
观众朋友们好，现在是美国东部时间5月24日，这里是华尔街网报当日第2期节目。现在我们继续为您关注到有关中国以及世界的最新消息。在刚刚您看到的视频是北师大昨晚操场上所发生的情况。根据网传一份致北师大全体同仁公开信写道：各位北师大同学大家好，请通知你觉得极其可信的同学加入我们的行动。如果你不想被强迫返乡，或者是在意自己的保研评优资格，请你至少高抬贵脚，不要做学贼。旁观也是对我们的帮助，谢谢你。大家一定警惕学贼，警惕外部势力。废话少说，我们对学校主要有2点诉求。第一，立刻无条件允许全体同学返乡，并尽可能由学校组织送站和行前核酸检验、文书和隔离服分发工作。学生一经出校，自愿开学前不返回，学校尊重学生返乡与否的决定。这个通知必须传达给全校师生。第二，线下考试转为线上或者是缓考，本学期改为考试的科目改回考察或减轻作业负担，撤回去年11月发布的培养方案或文件中关于专业选修课和全校通选选修课考核方式的更改，要求教务部门公开在公众平台和校园内为受到影响的教授、讲师和学生们道歉，并尽可能追究责任。同时，学校要书面承认同学 学们的要求是合理的，不追究任何人的责任，整个过程要全程录像或者是录音。为什么我们有这样的诉求呢？第一，一旦出事，以北师大的条件，同学们的生活学习根本无法保障，而且因为人口密度和卫生条件会比其他高校还要严重。第二，清华大学、北京大学、中国人民大学、北京航空航天大学、中国农业大学、北京外国语大学、中国政法大学等都已经放学生返校了，而其中很多学校都是以管理死板著称的。农大校长还曾扬言，你们就是学生，你们就得听我们的，你们就是没有地位，而现在已经服软。第三，全校师生连续16天核酸阴性，过去1个月无任何异常。学校如果积极组织送站，就不存在向其他省市传播新冠的客观条件。而且师生、员工、志愿者已经很累了，没有必要给他们再增加负担。我们怎么冲？第一，不能让自己孤立。校长董琦截至现在很久已经不在北太平庄校区了，驻守北太平庄校区的是程建平书记，他不是师大爬起来的学阀，是原清华大学常务副校长。我们要团结他，打开突破口，至少不能让他站在董琦一边，要向学校施压，最好经过他。所以我们到场的诉求是要见程建平书记。如果来的校领导没有副校长级以上的，那么他说的话都是没用的。我把副厅级以上领导的名录放在这里，分别是孙红培、李小兵、张凯、周作宇、王守军、涂青云、康震等。第二，要选好地点和时间，最好在上班时间的前主楼前。但是前主楼现在是核酸检测场所，我们去了给他们随便收拾，还要给我们扣干扰防疫、破坏防疫的帽子，这样就有风险。所以如果是主楼的话，几乎只能下午5点半去。校长办公室和党委办公室在前主楼 A 区4楼，去这里的话风险就小一些，但是不是在公共场所，影响力就变差了。看到现有的同学决定今天晚上8点在秋季端前聚集，那么再去主楼前也是可行的。这种做法是因为程书记一般都走得很晚，晚上能见度差，有利于保护大家的安全。但是万一没人来就尴尬了，一定要坚持住。第三，行动戴口罩和帽子，不要穿院衫。如果你要冲前排，就要有保研评优与你无关的觉悟。第四，坚决不要暴力行动，大家也阻止周围的同学这样做。届时以大楚兴、陈胜旺为口号。再要为您关注到的是今天国际媒体颇受关注的有关于新疆档案的相关情况。根据来自 BBC 的报道，本周二多家媒体共同披露文件，显示中国在新疆涉嫌侵犯人权行为的记录。今天，联合国人权高专办巴切莱特正式出访中国，而海外维吾尔族人则表示希望巴切莱特可以有所作为。新疆警察文件今天刚刚发布，是迄今新疆教育营内部最大规模的外泄资料。根据来自德国之音的报道，文章显示维族人受到大规模拘留的程度，包括有关当局所登记的30万中国人的信息，其中多数是维族人。据报道，这一次参与调查的总共有全球14家媒体机构，其中显示的照片、演讲和官方指示表明，这并非是中国政府此前所表示的职业技能教育培训中心，而是高度戒备的营地。媒体发布照片显示，有安全人员手持突击步枪，有多位手持木棍的男子将戴着手铐和脚镣的囚犯带走，而囚犯头上还戴着黑色布带。照片最后还显示某囚犯坐在一张老虎凳上。文件披露，新疆地区的党高层在2017年的讲话要求开枪射击任何试图逃跑的囚犯。在外露文件中，有许多人被监禁，其中有一位男子被指和母亲一起收听了1小时有关于宗教税的音频文件，2人被控准备实施恐怖主义行为，判处20年监禁。根据来自德国之声的报道，另外一位人则因34年前研究宗教文件获刑10年，罪名是准备实施恐怖行动。有人在健身中心锻炼15年，而安全部门认为他准备实施恐怖活动，而将其判监12年。 根据德国之声的整理报道，新疆警察文件是由匿名人士提供给德国人类学家郑国恩的。郑国恩声称，这一些档案是来自新疆伊犁和喀什地区公安局的计算机系统，而提供数据的第三方在入侵系统后取得文件并联系他。他表示，此人没有向他支付任何费用，而郑国恩也将文件内容转发给媒体。目前，中国当局没有回应照片和文件，但是同时，新疆档案的网站已显示无法登录，目前尚不知道是否是黑客所为。根据媒体关注，新疆警察文件发布的时机正好是联合国人权高专员巴切莱特访问中国之际。美国表示，中国在新疆实施种族灭绝。此前，国务院忧虑巴切莱特此行无法看到未经操纵的新疆的真实情况。
The Xinjiang police files is a set of thousands of files, documents, speeches, policy directives, spreadsheets, images, all kinds of files directly from police computers in 2 ethnic minority counties in Xinjiang. These files, because they're directly obtained from hacking into police computers and databases in Xinjiang, they for the first time give us a first-hand account of police operations inside re-education camps, of images taken during police drills, security drills in these camps, of speeches given by Chen Quanguo and other officials, where they just very directly talk about the attitudes and the threat that they see from the Uyghurs and how Uyghurs need to be arrested and how the camps need to be defended. The threat perception, the sort of paranoid threat perception comes out in these files, and the internal justification for why one has to move against an entire population, against so many people. It's very evident from the files, especially from a speech by the China's Minister of Public Security held in June of 2018, that Xi Jinping himself and the central government is watching it very closely, is very aware of the details of the mass internment and of the fact that the camps and the prisons are crowded. It says that. And that they need more money, they need more prisons, they need more staff, more detention centers. Beijing is going to give more money for the operating costs of the re-education camps. It says that in the document. And that shows how closely and intimately the central government has been involved in this atrocity from the beginning. So what we are seeing in the region is sort of Beijing's master plan to control, to break the back of entire ethnic groups by interning people, masses of people, key people, the old generation. We see how many elderly people are in the camps. We see that from the data. It shows like the taking out of a whole generation that's been transmitting cultural and spiritual knowledge, and of children being put into boarding schools. It's a whole program of assimilation, of assimilating an entire ethnic group. So the new evidence really shows that the re-education or the so-called vocational training in Xinjiang is nothing to do with poverty alleviation, nothing to do with helping people to get jobs. It's about brutal brainwashing. It's about putting them in prison camps guarded by heavily armed police. We have evidence, in the watchtowers that they use military-grade machine guns and sniper rifles in the watchtowers. And it's very clear that this is a campaign to break a people, to brainwash a people. Re-education, literally called 教育转化, transformation through education. So based on this new evidence, I think there are several important steps that policymakers really need to take now. Firstly, they need to really make a strong declaration of the direct involvement of Beijing, the central government, and Xi Jinping. How closely the central government has been controlling this and looking at this and has had intimate knowledge of it. And that really needs to be combined with sanctions against high central government officials in Beijing, not just the ones in Xinjiang. And this should also have further consequences for international relations, for the divestment economically from this region. Of course, the United States has already taken an important step. But we need to look also at European countries, the European Union, at other countries, at Muslim nations, countries that care about the human rights situation among the Uyghurs, among the Kazakhs, among these groups, that they really need to act against forced labor, that they need to sanction some of these Chinese officials and make clear that this cannot be business as usual anymore. It's, after all, most likely the largest incarceration of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust. So we can no longer say business as usual. And the new evidence really underlines the nature of this atrocity.
Property sales in April fell at their fastest pace since 2006, despite several rounds of policy easing. Interest rate cuts may help at the margin, but the specter of mass lockdowns still looms. A double whammy of defaults among developers and falling home prices continues to plague the industry. Evergrande, once China's largest developer and now its most indebted property giant, is currently unloading assets to pay down its massive debt. It's the world's second-largest economy experiencing its own Lehman moment. Joining me today to discuss is Nick Borst, Vice President and Director of China Research at Seafarer Capital Partners. Thank you, Nick, for being here with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Nick, before we turn to China, I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about the housing bubble that triggered the 2008 financial crisis. What caused the bubble to build up and eventually burst?
Yeah, well, thanks again for the question. And, I should start by saying this is a question that's still under hot debate in the US. Many dozens of books have been written. Many hundreds, probably more, will be written on the topic. But from my perspective, there's kind of two main factors that were behind the US financial crisis. The first was a deterioration in mortgage lending standards. So, throughout the mid-2000s, you saw the rise of subprime lending in the US, mortgages going to people with lower credit scores, less in the way of terms of down payment. So just a general decline in mortgage lending standards, the rise of subprime lending. This intersected with a huge trend towards securitization in the US financial system. So you had mortgages being packed into mortgage-backed securities that were sliced and diced and sold throughout the entire financial system. And there was this belief that if you kind of took what were somewhat risky financial products, packed them all together through the magic of diversification, you could turn relatively risky financial products into something that was safe. So when these two trends, the deterioration in mortgage lending standards and securitization intersected, you got a very explosive combination. So people were taking increasingly bad mortgage loans, packaging them up, pretending as if they were a lot less risky than they actually were, and selling them throughout the financial system. So when we reached kind of a point in 2005, 2006, where the US housing market started to slow down, then these financial products that were built off these mortgages really started to blow up. And, it's typically, at least in my view, what causes financial crisis is not when a risky financial product blows up. People kind of expect that. It's when something that's viewed as safe is then suddenly viewed as not safe. And that's really what happened with mortgage-backed securities. And so suddenly lots of financial institutions who had been kind of buying mortgage-backed securities by the handful, thinking that they were safe, a good return on investment, suddenly had these mortgages, couldn't unwind them, didn't understand how to value them. And it really brought the entire US financial system to its knees.
I see. And we see many pundits sort of drawing that parallel between the 2008 financial crisis and Evergrande's financial distress. But in a recent commentary, you actually argue against that notion. So elaborate on that. How is China's household balance sheet different from that of the United States? And what's the implication for this round of property market cleanup for China?
Yeah, so there are real and significant problems in the Chinese real estate sector, but those problems are very different than what happened in the US. So, going back to what happened in the US in terms of mortgage standards slipping, that hasn't happened in China, or it hasn't happened to nearly the same extent. So Chinese home buyers typically put down quite a significant down payment, 20, 30%. Chinese home buyers that are buying a second home put down even more than that. And so, in general, mortgages, Chinese home buyers have a very significant equity stake in their home, and you haven't seen the same slippage in lending standards. The other part of it is mortgage securitization. And again, in China, that's much, much less of an issue. China has a much smaller mortgage securitization market relative to where the US was in 2008. And so it really hasn't generated this kind of same very, very complex, very hard to unwind mortgage-backed securitization system within the financial system. So in that sense, the problems facing China are very different. There's always this tendency, I think, to want to, particularly in the US, we want to take our experience and apply it onto another economy. The US had a real estate crisis in this very specific context. We're looking for whether it will happen in China. What's going on in China, I think, is very different. And the key problems, and we can go into these in a little more detail, but for China, number one is the property developers have very risky balance sheets. Number two, it's that the local governments in China are very reliant on land sales. And number three, finally, the economy as a whole is very reliant on real estate to drive growth. So those are the problems that China is currently grappling with. It's not the same set of problems that the US was grappling with 15 years ago. And that's why I've always thought the comparison to Lehman Brothers really wasn't the correct one.
I see. And now the consensus seems to be some sort of correction in Chinese home prices is inevitable. How do you expect corrections in Chinese home prices to ripple through the economy?
Yeah, so it'll, if we get a Chinese home price correction, I think that's still to be determined, but it will, I think, have a significant impact on the Chinese economy. I think the first order impact is what we call the wealth effect. So that's, Chinese households have invested a lot of their savings in housing, whether that's people's primary home or secondary homes they've purchased as investments. And so there will be a direct impact on how wealthy people feel if there's a house price correction. So if you thought you had $500,000 worth of housing assets and suddenly prices correct, and now that property you purchased for $500,000 is only worth $300,000, you're certainly going to feel less wealthy, and you might pare back your consumption as a result of that. However, kind of drawing back to the US again, the difference is that, because the mortgage lending standards in China have been stricter this entire way through, China is not as much at risk of kind of the, we used to call in the US, kind of send your keys in the mail and walk away from the house. People who hadn't put any money down, hadn't been making any payments on the principal, really had no incentive to continue servicing their mortgage once prices fell. It's a very different situation in China where, because of those higher down payments, people have their own money at stake, they have skin in the game. And so I think there's less of a kind of acute risk of people walking away and defaulting in large numbers as a result of that. The second impact, I think, will be on local government finances. So local governments in China constantly have financial shortfalls. They're responsible for a lot of the spending within the Chinese government, but they get a disproportionately small share of the total revenues. And so one of the tools they've turned to, and it's turned out to be a major funding source for them, is land sales. So the government owns the land in China. Local governments will take land plots, they'll sell them to property developers, they'll pocket the funds and use that to kind of finance their overall government expenditures. With land sales slowing in China, with property developers in a weak state, that channel of financing for local governments is likely to slow considerably, and that'll put a lot of stress on Chinese local governments who are already highly indebted. Kind of the third major impact of a housing price correction in China would just be the overall kind of macro effects. So, the estimates of this vary, but typically between 25 to 30% of the Chinese economy is wrapped up in real estate in one way or the other. So whether that's kind of direct through real estate developers or construction companies, or all the kind of ancillary industries that supply the real estate sector, including, consumer durables and all sorts of suppliers. So these industries, as if Chinese home prices correct and the real estate market continues to slow down, it's all these industries that are going to be affected. And so that'll have a net negative drag on the Chinese economy. Housing investment will slow down, all the related industries will slow down. So those are kind of the key economic impacts of a housing market correction. And I think, the difference from my perspective is that whereas in the US, it was much more sort of an acute financial crisis driven by securitization, in China, it's more of a kind of overall macro slowdown given the great importance that the housing sector plays in the Chinese economy overall. So it's really kind of a very different set of problems that both countries are dealing with.
I see. And, in an ideal world, the Chinese policymakers would execute a soft landing, right? Sort of try to tame its, indebted property developers without shaking broader home buyer or investor confidence. But in the real world, how should they actually do that?
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation, and I don't think there's any magic bullet. What appears to be going on to some extent is what I call a slow motion nationalization of the property sector. Mm-hmm. So you have a lot of the privately owned property developers are basically not able to get much credit anymore. They're financially strapped, they're facing lots of pressure. And what's happening is that they're selling a lot of their properties over to the state-owned property developers. And so the state-owned property developers, because of their closer connections to the government, are generally more able to access financing. And so you have a shift of housing assets, going from private developers over to state-owned developers. And so while that may kind of put a floor under the property development industry, I think kind of in the long run, it's a negative development, because I think it means that the property sector and by extension the entire Chinese economy will become marginally more state-oriented, less privately oriented. For the entire, approach to resolving the property market, it's quite difficult. The problem has built up over many, many years, and so there's no easy solution. What I would recommend to Chinese policymakers is just to ease up a little bit. So there was this big push at the end of 2020 with lots of policies, most notably the 3 red lines, to really clean up the property sector, to force property developers to strengthen their balance sheets, to reduce leverage. And all of that makes sense from sort of a long-term macro perspective, but it has created real problems given China's current growth situation, where the economy is slowing down, there's COVID lockdowns, financing is generally more difficult to get than it was in the past. And so from my perspective, while the kind of long-term goal that they're trying to achieve maybe makes sense, the timing is off. It's not the right time to push very hard. And I think you've seen very clear reaction to that with many of the largest Chinese property developers kind of defaulting on bonds and other borrowings that they've done. And so we're starting to see like a bit of a retraction in some of those policies where the government is easing up a little bit, kind of easing the pressure a little bit, but still I think, there's more to be done. I'd like to see more to cut mortgage rates to kind of boost the market in that sense. I think there's more China could do to stimulate consumption and overall consumer sentiment. And I think while the goals of forcing property developers to be more responsibly managed and to clean up their balance sheets are good long-term goals, you got to be careful about how hard you push, particularly when the economy is in a difficult environment.
Right, as you alluded to, the Chinese economy is going to be facing a very challenging year. There's COVID lockdown, as you mentioned. There's also significant headwinds this year due to disruptions in the external environment, the war in Europe, etc. So do you think policymakers in China are going to put property market cleanup on the back burner? Is it going to come back later this year or early next year when COVID situation gets resolved? What's that timeline look like?
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's a very difficult macroeconomic environment for China right now, where COVID lockdowns, we've had major Chinese cities under lockdown for several months now. There seems to be kind of a large soft lockdown over much of the country. Consumer sentiment is very weak in China. Consumption really has not bounced back to its kind of pre-pandemic trend. And, China's facing a difficult external situation where, relations with the U.S. continue to deteriorate. The Fed is raising interest rates. That puts a little bit of pressure on China. And so it's quite a tough environment for Chinese policymakers to kind of push through these changes to the real estate sector, which would be, difficult in any circumstance, but are especially difficult right now. What I personally worry about is I think, the top officials in the Chinese government, including Xi Jinping, have said now for 5 years that housing is for living, not for speculation. And so I think setting out that kind of political marker makes it very difficult for them to change policy and adjust in the face of kind of different economic situations. So I think we're seeing some tweaks at the margin where they're trying to roll back a little bit of some of these more damaging policies. But I think politically, it's very difficult for them to kind of do an about face and say, actually, no, what we need is to kind of give the housing market some support in the short run and maybe address some of these long-term issues over time. So that's kind of my main concern is that, through rhetoric and public statements that the Chinese government has sort of boxed itself into a very specific approach to the housing market. And that's going to be hard to change domestically, even if the macroeconomic situation is very different from when that policy was first rolled out.